Welcome to the Tone Lounge Podcast, the definitive music industry and gear podcast with Jonathan Gilmet and Frank Fleckenstein.
What's up, guys? Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, or good night when you're listening to us just before going to bed. This is the Tone Lounge Podcast. My name is Frank, and with me today, as always, my good buddy and co-host, Jonathan Gilmet, aka what was the Duke of Voxington?
The Duke of Voxington, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And also with us, a special guest today from Stringjoy, Scott.
Hi guys, thanks for having me.
I thought that was me because I'm wearing the shirt.
Yeah, the images are misleading here.
Yeah.
Isn't that? Who am I? If you're Scott from Stringjoy.
You're John. I'm Scott. What's going on?
So, first of all, Scott, thanks for taking the time to join us. Where are you located, actually?
Yeah, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee.
Nice.
Yep, and in fact, it's just a wall of guitars behind me, but on the other side of that wall is a whole manufacturing plant.
Right.
Really? Okay.
So you're right in the middle of it. You might hear the occasional banging or whirring or sound of a wobbly cart going by, which is all part of the magic.
Yeah, you might hear a complaining child in the background sometimes here. That's my son. So
It can sound like that here too. Yeah, I'm familiar.
So I was really looking forward to this episode for a couple of reasons. A, we've never spoken to someone who's in the string manufacturing business, so it's interesting to have something fresh on this podcast. We usually talk to YouTubers, we talk to guys who are into manufacturing guitars or pedals or whatever it is. But I think many people feel like strings, because they're such a daily thing. They don't really go into the depth of what it takes to manufacture guitar strings and what the differences are. I feel like a lot of players just they have some strings that maybe they get recommended by the guy in the store, and then they stick with those strings because they didn't break. So if nothing goes wrong, don't change anything. Yeah. But obviously there's a lot more to it. So what's your function at Stringjoy?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the founder and president. I started Stringjoy as a bit of a side project, which I'm sure we'll probably get into that whole story in time.
Yes.
And now I run the whole company. There are about 30 of us or so, mostly here in Nashville at headquarters, making strings with some people, often different regions that do tasks that don't have to be manual and here in person. So yeah, it's fun. It's a constantly evolving job. I think my job's very different than it was 3 years ago when we were smaller, and I imagine it'll be very different in 3 more years.
Right. And so when you said you started this as a side business,
yeah.
I know it needs machines to make strings. So when you say you start this as a side business, I started making pedals as a side business. That's an easier thing to do because you need a few things, and I think it's easy to organize that.
Yeah. But
you obviously, you had to organize a machine, in order to wind strings. So how did that start?
Yeah. It's funny. So the way that the kind of everything flowed was way back in 2014, I was working in the music industry as an artist manager. And that was cool. I learned a ton, but I knew I kind of wanted to get into something tangible. I always like making things I could touch and using my hands for things. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I had a lot of different weird ideas. And I ultimately kind of honed in on this one kind of unique thing, which is that since I was in high school, I'd been customizing my string gauges. So I would buy like 2 or 3 sets, or sometimes I could find a store that had like a giant rack of single strings all packaged up. That was great if I could, but typically it's buying a couple sets and mixing them together. Because I had the set that I'd kind of, wheedled out and found that I really liked, but I couldn't buy it from anybody. So I just had always kind of been doing this. And when I was in this like exploration of like, what do I want to do? What would be a cool thing? I came to that. I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. I haven't really thought about it. And I wonder if there's other weird people like me out there, maybe that play in a different tuning or have some particular use case where they need different strings than what are on the rack. So I had about $500 to my name at the time. I was just bartending in between gigs. And I got a hold of like a really small string manufacturer and was like, hey, can you make me 12 of every gauge of string that you make? Just like 12 each in like tubing or whatever's easier for you. And he agreed to do that, which is kind of odd. As a manufacturer now, I would never, that would be a pain in the butt. But he did. And so that was like my $500 that I had. And I set up shop in the attic of the house that I was living in with 4 other guys and 3 dogs and, everyone's girlfriends and all this. And so I would work with people online and just be like, hey, what do you need? You play a 335, you play in DADGAD. Okay. And I would, kind of learn a lot about tension and all that and match a set of strings that worked really well for you. So that was the original conception of the business. I wasn't making strings or anything like that. That would have been, that would have cost a lot more than $500.
No.
But that kind of took off fairly quickly. Like in the first month, we did like $2,000 in sales, which is not crazy, but to a bartender, I was like, hey, that's some real money. There's something here. And so that kind of grew and grew from there. I found like a whole bunch of guys in the metal world that were being underserved. That was kind of the first thing that really made sense. Like there weren't many 7 and 8 string sets out there, and we were able to help with that. And so, just kind of yada-yadaing over a whole lot. What happened was I got really into the strings themselves because I started building these sets for like thousands of different players. And so I was like, I wish I could get a 26 nickel that had like a slightly thinner core and that would work better for some of these use cases. So I started calling the guy that was making my strings and being like, hey, on this batch, I want you to make a 48 with the core of a 46. I want you to make a 26, like this. And he put up with that for a little bit. And after a little while was like, hey, I have 2 machines that I want to sell you. And you're going to buy them from me. I'll show you how to use them for like a day. I'll come out to Nashville and show you. And then after that, like, we're done. You're never gonna deal with me again.
That's a success story right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was kind of presented in a like, probably this isn't going to work regardless. So this is your option if you want to keep doing this. So I got an SBA loan for like $30,000 or something, and bought those 2 from him and was up and running with a very, very small string manufacturing plant.
One question in between, because you said you bought 2 machines, just so that everybody gets an idea, like what's the size of one of those machines?
Oh yeah, sure. So I mean, they're maybe 30% bigger than like an upright piano that you might see in a parlor. If you picture that size and scale it up a little bit, they're about 8 feet long, about like 3.5, 4 feet deep. And then depending on the model, these early ones were about like 3.5 or 4 feet tall. So not small.
Right.
But, and these were really old machines. I can tell you, they were built in the late 70s and they passed through a lot of different hands. They were originally made for the DeQuisto String Company, which was Jimmy DeQuisto, John D'Angelico's sort of Padawan that started up. And then they passed through a couple different hands before they made it to me. And, we're kind of hunks of junk, but kind of beautiful. Like they needed everything changed out over time. But to a gear nerd, you're like, this is great. I need to change a motor. What are the specs of the motor? How can I improve this or improve that? So in the process of just having to fix like a new problem every day on these really old machines, I learned a ton about how these worked, and also was able to like experiment to my heart's content, which was a joy for me. I was like, oh my God, I can make a 26 10 different ways and see what works better, what works worse, and all this. So that really opened the door for me to do a ton of experimentation and really kind of hone in on what I thought were kind of the perfect guitar strings.
Wow. And so obviously over time the company has grown. So how many machines do you own at this point?
Yeah, so I don't comment on the exact number of machines because everyone's always trying to check in on our capacity and whatnot.
No,
competitors and things.
Don't worry.
But we've got a room full of them, enough to have about 30-ish people employed on them. So quite a bit. We do run 3 shifts, so we're using our machines as best as we can. But those early 2 machines are no longer really in service. I use them for R&D here and there. We're on to much more modern kind of custom machines that we built in the spirit of those, but with a lot more bells and whistles and features that we can utilize now.
Okay. And since you said that those machines were built in the 70s,
Yeah.
are machines like this still built to this day, or is I mean, where do you find them? I mean, where do you find a company that makes a machine, that makes strings?
Yeah, there's a couple different schools of thought on guitar string winding machines. And I should say, I should probably open with this. There are a few different machines that are utilized in the process of making like a string set. So briefly, the first in the process is a ball ending machine. So it feeds core wire and then attaches that brass ball to it with a distinctive sort of twist that we can program in and keep just right. And then what I've been talking about are winding machines. That's kind of like the real art of the process, how we wind that wrap wire around that core wire. And then we've got a couple different packaging machines as well. But to your question, yeah, it's a very niche world. There's not that many string manufacturers in the world. So the couple of folks that are still making string winding equipment or ball ending equipment almost universally are like the grandchildren of somebody that got into this racket somehow, and so they carry on the tradition. And they're not very easy to find. Maybe by design, or maybe it's just so niche that it's hard. There's not a lot of other applications with these machines. Like they're made for guitar strings.
Gotcha.
The only thing that I've seen you could make reinforced heart catheters are kind of similar to flat wound strings. They're wound kind of similar to that. But for the most part, yeah, it's a very niche world, the string world.
Interesting. Yeah, because I've heard, and that's something I've heard from a couple of guys in the industry. About 10 years ago or something, when they were talking about strings, they were always referring to the fact that there are only a handful of factories now these days, like worldwide, and most manufacturers have their strings made to their specifications in those factories.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, and I had heard that too growing up. It's true that there are fewer string manufacturers than there are string brands, for sure. Like if you're going to a store and looking at the wall, not all of those companies are making their own strings. But there's a lot more than people would expect. There's definitely. I always heard there were 3, and there's more than that. There's just about a few short of a dozen in the U.S. and others elsewhere in Argentina, a few in Europe, Mexico, other various places. So it is more prevalent than people would think. But yeah, there's a lot of what we call private label or OEM manufacturing, where one company will make something to somebody else's specs, and sometimes that is made to their like specs, but like a lot of times it's just they're like, hey, give me a 10 to 46 set, and they're like, okay, here you go. And it's kind of the same thing you would otherwise buy from a different brand. So I know what you mean, and it's interesting. I do think that sort of rumor or belief is part of what's led people to being like, yeah, all strings are probably the same. It's all probably one company behind all these things,
Yes, and that was I think that was going around, especially with sales reps that worked for a distributor that had a certain type of string, probably to tell when they go into a store to tell the guys, hey, it all comes from the same factory anyways, but hey, ours come from a different one.
I think there's also like, I don't know that there was this intention or not, but there's certainly like a strategic advantage if you're one of the largest ones who, presumably does make their own strings, even though a lot of us do, into making people think like, these are all the same, so you really should just buy the cheapest. And since you're the biggest, you've got the economies of scale. It's like if McDonald's was like, all food's the same, so you may as well as get the $1 burger from McDonald's. If it's all the same, why spend any more?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, you're right. It's interesting. The number I heard, because you said you were told there were 3. The number I heard was 5. It's like there are only 5 manufacturers in the world, and everybody's buying their strings from there. But but do you still do custom gauges? Or you still do that? Okay.
We do. It's about like 10% of our business now. Obviously at one point it was 100%. But we still do it. It's a bit of a pain. But it's it's part of our heritage, so it's a cool thing that we'll always kind of have to do for folks.
Right, but obviously you're gonna have to charge more for it, because there's it's not like the typical.
Well, right now we still charge the same price for custom sets as we do for our non-custom sets.
Oh,
and
nice.
we do, give up a bit of margin there for sure. But again, it's kind of always been on that promise. We played once with charging $1 more, so it's not always been that case. But ultimately, it's a cool thing that we offer, and so we like to be able to do it for folks.
Yeah, 100%. I've actually placed an order, I think like last year or something, because Jonathan recommended that I try the strings. I've been on like 2 or 3 different manufacturers in the past, and one thing that I noticed, and I've bought the nickel wound, and I've also, what were the other ones that are pure nickel?
So the signatures are our nickel
Broadways.
wound; those are our most popular,
Yeah.
and the broadways are our pure nickel. That's a vintage style string, which I can go into what makes that vintage if you're interested. But
one thing that I found with the signatures was they are way more consistent than what I was used to from other manufacturers. So, and I'm happy to just name it because it's out there anyways. So, if I compared it to a set of Diodarios, and I buy these in bulk, these big like with 25 sets or something, because I'm building guitars and I just needed something to but every string is kind of different. Every string is kind of different. What you might have a low E string that you hit it and it's it comes out strong, and sometimes it comes out like rubber. It's softer, and I didn't have that feeling with the signatures, which makes me think that obviously, I mean, you're a not as large of an operation as Diodario, so you can pay more attention to detail. The other thing I found out is that in general, the strings that you do are more stable.
we
So
hear that a lot.
Yeah, they're more stable, especially to people who have a very hard pick attack, which I belong to these group of people. I play a very hard pick, and I like to hit them. So for me, that comes in handy. What goes into making a string like that? What's the process like? Obviously, it has to do with the core. The core plays a huge part. So maybe walk us through.
Yeah. So, the core wire of the string, you're absolutely right, does play a very big part. And, that's music wires. So there's a couple different manufacturers that draw that down to different specs that are good enough for guitar strings. So which of those manufacturers you utilize for the core can definitely matter. Testing internally, making sure that what you're receiving from them is consistent and up to your specs, that definitely matters. For us, I think a lot of it comes down to that ball ending and winding process. I always tell people, it's impossible to make good strings with bad wire, but it's very possible to make bad strings with good wire. So we want to make sure we're getting good stuff in, but then after that, it's kind of up to us. So kind of the step one in the process is how we're ball ending that string. So a lot of people have problems with strings like coming undone from some major manufacturers on Jazz Masters and things like that. They'll ask us like, hey, do you do like a soldered or a fused twist string? We find that we don't have to. Our strings hold really well. It's mostly just from running that machine slower than most people run it. Which is a common theme you'll see come up a few times in our process. But even with a good ball and twist, it really comes down to the winding of the string. So what we're doing is we're stretching out that piece of core wire, and then we're attaching some wrap wire and then winding it in a helix fashion across the whole length of the string to make a total wound string. Electric and acoustic guitar strings, it's just like one turn of wire. For bass strings or heavier strings, it could be multiple, which is kind of a whole different thing. But the most important things that you're kind of looking for there is the amount of tension that you're pulling that core wire to, the consistency of tension applied to the wrap wire as it's being applied to that core is super important. And then exactly where those turns of wrap wire end up. So if you imagine like that you're holding some wrap wire and spinning it onto core wire, if you go really fast, you can get some gaps between each turn of wrap wire. And if you go really slow, it might double up over top of itself and create a bump or a ridge. So the precision with which that's applied over the whole length of the string is really, I think, kind of the biggest thing that's going to impact your strings. Because a waveform travels through a string, and forgive me, nerd alert for anybody. But a string basically stretched between 2 points on your guitar, its job is when you pluck it, it's going to have that musical waveform of whatever note you put through it. And the degree to which that waveform can move through the string consistently is the degree to which you're going to have an in-tune note, and a note that's in tune at all of your harmonic intervals over top. When you have areas where that wrap is too tight or too loose, that waveform breaks down just a little bit over there, and you get what's called inharmonicity. So your overtones are a little bit out of tune with your fundamental. But with us, kind of zooming out of there, the thing that you're experiencing when it comes to that stability of strings has everything to do with how tight we're pulling that core wire when we're winding it. We pull it close to playing tension, actually a little bit more frequently, and how tight we're winding those turns of wrap wire next to each other. If you leave a little bit of room in between those wrap wires or wind with a really loose core wire, you get a really, to use an industry term, a very slinky string. And you can feel it. If you hold it by the ball end, you can feel it really kind of shaking around like a limp snake. That is a string generally that has, some slight more distance between those turns of wrap wire. It has less of mass of wrap wire, really, is what's going on. So our strings are a little bit more stable because of that. They're wound a little bit tighter. They have higher mass of wrap wire on the core wire generally, is at least what we're aiming for. And that, with a bunch of nerd speak aside, is what means that when you put a set of Stringjoy strings on your guitar, what we always hear from people is, I don't have to tune as much.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a question.
Please.
There's a disconnect for me here. How do you go from being a musician who bartends and then become like so enamored with the technology and the way of doing the stuff? Like, did you have to hire consultants to come in, or did you go painstakingly through all the different strings and go through thousands of them to come up with the recipe that you now have for Stringjoy? Because if I were to start this, I'd have no idea where to start. So
it's an imposing thing, and I often think if I knew what I was getting into when I started, I don't know if I would have, or at least I would have thought twice about it. But like anything, it's just taking just one day at a time, basically, and constantly wanting to just get better and better and better and better, turns into this whole journey, which is kind of wild. But to your question, it's ultimately a lot of trial and error over many years.
Oh, yeah, that's crazy.
We've made every string basically every way there is to make that string, or as many ways as we can find thus far to make that string, and picked the ones that worked best for us. And our strings have improved over the years, for sure. I'm very grateful that we were like small or very small when we started out, because we've been able to learn a lot. And by the time that most people were hearing about us and tried out a set, they're pretty darn good.
Right.
But it was the result of a lot of trial and error.
That's nuts. Like, I just can't fathom how many strings you have to go through to actually start to feel confident to start a company and sell these, because otherwise that means that your learning curve is happening as your business is launching, right? So you're going to have a lot of returns on strings saying, people, these are duds, they're not working. Not everyone could go through that. So in my mind, like, being very cautious, if I were starting a string company, I'd want to know everything before the launch date. Like, I'd be like, I want to be a pro. So I'm going to get all these consultants. I want to know everything about these alloys and how to, put them together so I get the optimal string. I want to be completely different than what the other guys are making. Mm-hmm. And from the way you're talking, you seem to me like you're a fast learner. You actually enjoy what you're doing, and you're adapting rather quickly. So is that kind of what makes the success of Stringjoy starting off? Because I don't know, were you guys on YouTube like right away? Were you knocking that out, or did that take a while before you got there?
It took a couple of years before we got there. I'm not sure if it was 2017, somewhere around there maybe, that we started getting on there. But yeah, it very much has been an emergent thing. And I mean, like I'm really good at researching and taking in vast quantities of information and making sense of it and kind of arriving at something and then testing it and iterating it and all that. I think that's kind of my skill that's enabled me to get here. But yeah, it's a little crazy looking back at it, to be honest. Like even for me, I'm like, yeah, how did we make that work? But it was just a lot. All that research sets you up into a good foundational place at the beginning. But then, yeah, it's constant tweaks. But I mean, it's not like we were anything that we tweaked internally. I would like give a thumbs up on my own guitars before I'd be like, okay, that feels good enough that we can go out to a customer. So we weren't like just totally experimenting widely with everyone's strings all the time. But we always have something. I mean, even most of these guitars behind me, actually probably all of them, have just like a random collection of strings on them that have been made over time, where it's like 3 different ways to approach a 36 or on different guitars, so that we can test and see and evaluate and see what works best and better.
That's nuts.
And even a number of these have strings that are not released yet, or things that we've been working on.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, so that means you're still looking for the perfect string.
Oh, always. Yeah. I mean, these days it's very small. It's very granular improvements on the stuff that we like make traditionally now. Like I made a tweak a year ago to the way that we were doing our 42s on our phosphor bronze strings.
Okay.
I adjusted the core down by about 1/1000th of an inch. That to me was just like that little 5% better thing that we found. So it wasn't bad before that, but I just found a way to make it, I think, even better.
I've also seen, and that has been a very controversial topic among electric guitarists, but also acoustic guitarists. I've seen that you also do coated, at least coated acoustic strings.
Coated acoustic and electric. Oh, Jonathan, you got every prop for me before I even asked for it.
Yeah, I got you.
Orbiters. Now I see them.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
orbiters. Yeah.
Orbiters.
Yep.
Okay.
I know some people can't see them, but if they're just listening to the podcast, but yeah, orbiters.
So, what exactly does the coating consist of? And because obviously, people know what's their name?
Elixir.
Yeah, Elixir, exactly. Yeah. I was thinking about Gore because that's the head company, but so people know Elixirs, and then when Elixirs had this like huge success, especially for acoustic guitar players, suddenly everybody made coated strings, and some of them I found to be absolutely terrible, and others I found okay-ish. So, what's your approach on coated strings?
Yeah, so for a long time we didn't make them. I was not generally a big coated string fan in my life prior to Stringjoy. So we started on the uncoated side, but we're always kind of playing around. The sort of evolution of coated strings. So they were, as you noted, invented by W.L. Gore, the company that makes Gore-Tex, and all sorts of coated fabrics, non-stick skillets, all sorts of things. And they, for a long time, had a patent on being able to coat over top of the string. So for them, they'll take like a standard finished string that's uncoated and then apply a coating around the outside, and it kind of fills in the gaps between each winding and creates the coated string that everyone knows. Because they had that patent, other companies, when they went to make a coated string, they're like, okay, how do we get around this? So what they started doing is coating the wrap wire and coating the core wire separately, and then winding those into a coated string.
Okay.
So what we ended up doing is taking a coated wrap wire. So it's our wrap wires. It's like a very hard sort of enamel style coating, not soft like a PTFE sort of coating that you commonly see. We took that coated wrap wire and we wound it around an uncoated core. And the only reason that we can do this is because of our winding process. So I mentioned how we endeavor to get each turn of wrap wire so tight to the one before it. Because of that, coated wrap wire will still form a nice barrier where sweat, dirt, grime, and stuff can't get down to the core wire itself. And for us, that's kind of the secret sauce that made our coated string kind of unique. Because the strings that had coated wrap wire and coated core wire, I find to sound pretty dead pretty fast. There's something about and I'm not even sure if it's a great idea to have like one coated wire against another coated wire, or if you get some friction there. So for us, because of that winding process, being able to coat just one thing made a string that's really, really lively. And it kind of surprised me when we are indeed the Foxwoods. That was the first ones that we made, our acoustic strings. They're brighter than our uncoated strings, having to do with that particular coating that we're using on the wrap wire, it being so hard.
Right.
What seems to be happening, as I've kind of looked into it, is that the coating applied to the phosphor bronze wrap wire is harder than the phosphor bronze wrap wire is itself. So you're making it harder, making it function more like something like a stainless steel almost, not quite that far, but as an example, rather than a softer copper wrap wire. And that's why you're getting that really bright, sort of rich timbre off of those.
Okay, but the coating is made of some sort of like a plastic, or like what kind of material is that?
It's a trade secret, the exact nature of it, but it's very similar to like enameled wires that's used in like electrical uses and things like that.
Gotcha. Okay,
that's where we were.
I just wanted to get the idea because I knew what the concept is always, especially when when Elixir came out, and then Diadario also made some coated strings. And you're right. My first impression was always like everybody was like applauding them for coming up with these things, and everybody was buying them, and they were like ridiculously expensive. Yeah. And I always found like, okay, but they kind of sound kind of dull, like dull, dead, like very little harmonic. So the only guitar brand, and that is acoustic, where I found that they really worked was on Taylor guitars, because Taylor guitars are made in a way where there's just like in your face loud projection. You sit in front of somebody playing a Taylor and he hits the string, and it's like it's like a kick in the nuts or in the face, and then with that sort of guitar, the strings would work. But the other thing that was always bothering me, I saw people playing these coated strings, and they play like for one or two shows. I'm always telling I can leave this on for a month. But the coating would wear off, especially when you're playing with a pick, so fast. And then they like the guitar was full of the coating, like everything was full of dust, and the string looked kind of weird because it was coated. There was an uncoated region. Yeah, it was kind of weird.
Yeah, it's strange. And what I like to tell folks is like, we make a coated string for people that don't really like coated string. So people that want the longevity of a coated string, but like the feel of an uncoated string, or more the tone of an uncoated string. And I've learned that that's about half the coated market. The other half of the coated market really like the feel and sound of coated strings for whatever reason. They like it to feel super smooth and all that. Our coated strings are not a great match for that. And I think truly, if you wanted to capture the whole coated market, which is not really my aim, you would need to make like a super coated string with a really thick coating to feel really smooth for those players. And then, something really, really thin like ours that performs more like an uncoated string. So it's a diverse market of people that just hated changing their strings, so they moved to there and are like, I will play anything that lasts this long, versus people that were like, oh, I love how these feel.
Right.
Yeah, for anyone that doesn't like to change strings on guitar, there's a thing called flat wounds. They're great.
That also will work for that.
Yeah. It's like they're coated. They're just coated by design. You don't have to change their strings, and they always sound dead. It's awesome.
Well, and that's the thing. The original patent for coated strings references a tape wound patent, because similarly, tape wounds are using a nylon, very thick nylon like tape wire to create what is effectively a coated string.
Yeah,
albeit a deader one.
While we're talking about materials, I earlier mentioned the Broadways, so the pure nickel strings, where you said those are like a little bit more like a vintage type string. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think it's interesting. I think it would be interesting for people to hear like the difference, because everybody talks about like, those are nickel wound, those are pure nickel, but I think there are not many people who really understand like the sort of more granular information on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two kind of big changes in string making occurred in the late 60s and early 70s. One was that prior to this point, electric guitar strings had been made with what's known as pure nickel wrap wire. It's not actually pure nickel, but it's almost entirely just nickel elementally. They were using this, and as far as I can actually reason, the main reason why they switched to nickel-plated steel, which is what's more used now, was that pure nickel wire is really expensive. Nickel's an expensive material itself, so by weight, it's very expensive. So those string winders that were around at the time were like, okay, maybe we can switch to this and save some money since it's just mild steel for 92% of its weight versus that expensive nickel. This did coincide, however, with nickel-plated steel had more mid-range, it had kind of more spank and brightness, and that worked really well with this rock and roll thing that was starting to happen in the late 60s. So that kind of worked together. The other big change was that prior to the early 70s, not all, but most strings were made with round core wire versus what we more often use now, which is hexagonal core wire.
Right.
All that means is if you look at the core wire of the string and cut it in half and look at the cross section, hexagonal has these 6 little points that it comes to, whereas round core wire is itself round. So the biggest kind of pain in the butt with round core wire is that the wrap wire doesn't stick. It doesn't adhere very well to the core wire. So you have to flatten a portion of it at one end, and then you wind up to that point, and that'll kind of hold it together. But when somebody installs that string, they need to put a hard crimp in it to put it into a vintage tuner, like before you cut off that flattened portion, or it'll slip and sound bad. And so when hexagonal core wire came out, it just made things a lot simpler. You can cut it at any point. You don't have to communicate this to people of like, hey, here's how to install these or you'll ruin the string. But anyway, so the Broadways, what kind of like my initial, conception of this is I was like, oh man, I'm a guitarist. So like guitarists are the only people in the world that assume that everything older is better, for whatever reason. So I was like, all right, I want to see what strings were made like in the late 50s, early 60s. This is many, many years ago. And I bought a bunch of them. And my initial thing was like, I'm going to model these like perfectly one-to-one, make notes on what I think work best, and then create like a total vintage accurate guitar string.
Right.
Well, so I bought a bunch of those strings and took them apart. And in a lot of cases, I would take their recipe and make a new one with that same recipe. What I kind of quickly learned is that most of those strings really stunk. Like they were really bad.
Wow. Okay.
The biggest like kind of commonality is that pure nickel wrap wire was really expensive, so they used as thick of core wire as they could get away with, and as little wrap wire as they could to kind of save on cost. So you had these very dead kind of inharmonic strings that weren't very good. So what I ended up doing is going back to the drawing board and building the string that I had expected to find inside those packages out of those original materials, round core wire, pure nickel wrap wire. And that's kind of what became the Broadways. So they're a super flexible, but still vintage sounding string. They're very cool. For a long time, guitar players strings were an impediment. They were fighting their strings all the time. The modern gauges of guitar strings were kind of formed by accident. Like a set of 10s, they didn't used to sell 10s. They would sell like 12s, 13s, 14s. So some players started buying a single banjo string, which they sold in 9s and 10s, and then buying a set of 13s, throwing away the low E, which is usually a 56, and then hanging on to the rest, the 13, 17, 26, 36, 46, sliding them all down one.
That's interesting.
That's how plain thirds were emerged. It was always a wound third before then, but then the third string became the fourth string, and you had 3 plain strings to work with. And this happened so that people could make these huge bends that were happening in rock and roll. People weren't only playing jazz anymore. They were playing rock and roll and needed lighter strings. So that gauging of that set was just totally emergent based on people throwing stuff together from what they could find off the rack.
Yeah, it's interesting. You normally associate like wound third strings with jazz players. Or with guys who just play rhythm, and they are far away from even thinking about bending a string. So there's just rhythm players, and it makes more sense for them. That was, and you mentioned earlier that you had obviously the metal players in your pocket very early, because it's difficult for some of these guys, especially with some of these low tunings, to find the right strings. I also had to buy single strings when back in the days we were tuning to a drop A or something.
Yeah.
On a regular scale guitar, which means obviously you need very thick strings. So I ended up, buying same thing, like a set of 10s, and then throwing away the first,
Yep,
and just using a 64, and then the rest of the set, Yeah. So
that's a good way to do that. And you're right. I mean, that's a totally underserved market. I mean, even as many people play in drop C as do these days, it's tons. The kind of most common set people do is that Ernie Ball 12 to 56 set. And it says on there like optimized for down tuning. Yeah. So that's the thing, is all sets are made for standard tuning, and all anyone's ever really done is just picked a heavier one when they tune down.
Right.
But drop C on a 12 to 56, it's way overkill on the top 5 strings. The 12 and 16, and oh my god, that plain 24. That set has this plain 24 string, which it should be a plain 20 at most. But they were switching from a 12 set would traditionally have a wound 24. So I'm guessing that way back in the day when they built it, they were just like, let's do a plain 24.
Yeah.
But wound and plain strings have way more tension at the same gauge than wound strings do. So it's a lot. Anyway, that is all to say, it's still not heavy enough for the C, and it's not heavy, or it's way too heavy on the top 5.
Yeah.
We have an 11 to 58 set that's like made for that kind of does it just right. But players just have this thing, and I can't tell you how many times I'll talk to players that are doing this, and they're like fighting their strings, and they're like, why would I play your strings? What's wrong with these? I'm like, oh my god, please let me show you. Please just like pick up this guitar and you'll see.
I have a question about string gauges. So I remember a few years ago on the Stringjoy YouTube channel, there was a talk of the string gauge that some of the older companies have versus what you guys came up with. You have very different numbers for the gauges. Can you tell us more about like how you came to that realization that perhaps like the standard that we've been playing for a long time might not be exactly what we need?
Totally, yeah. So, like I was saying earlier, most of those sets were kind of pieced together by happenstance by players that were, subbing things in. So no one ever really looked at like, if this set was made for E to E, 10 to 40, like to 46, would it be different than a 13 to 56 set adapted down? And it'd be close, but slightly different. Yeah. So very early on, I mean, this is before we were even making strings, because I was building those custom sets for people. What I ended up doing was making little swaps. So we would do a 13.5 instead of a 13, which has the same tension as the 10 and the 17 on a 10 set. And we would do a 48 instead of a 46, which has the same tension as the 26 and 36. If you like pick up a telly with 10 to 46s, you can bend that low E all the way down to the midpoint of the neck on the back side. It has way less tension than the other strings on it. So it just needs a little bit more bump to balance everything out overall there. So we did that with basically every gauge. And some things were closer than others. Our 11 set is not very different than a typical 11 set. Our 10s is different in those two ways. Our 9s can be a little bit different too. And that was ultimately looking at the tension math for those, of evaluating what you have on in terms of tension at this gauge on a 24 and 3/4 and 25 and a half guitar, and just getting everything to match a little bit better there than what was commonly thought to be the thing.
Okay, and follow-up question on this one. Mm-hmm. So if, let's say I have custom order here from you guys, so 8.5. So let's say 8.5 or 9.5. Does that change the math of the other gauges of strings depending on if you go like one up 0.5 or down 0.5? Or does it stay relatively the same?
It depends a little bit. Yeah. So like we might go 9, 12, 15 on a set of 9s, whereas for 9.5, we like 9.5, 13, 16. Those have about the same amount of tension. Okay. It can vary a bit, and it varies depending on your tuning, the scale length, and things like that. We do have a tension calculator at tension.stringjoy.com that a lot of folks will use to try to get things to match visually a little bit better.
Okay.
But yeah, so it can have a bit of a difference. One thing I often will tell people is half gauges are a really great thing if you are a Gibson and a Fender player and want them to have a really similar feel. So in general, 9.5s on a Fender will feel about the same as 10s do on a Gibson. There's about a half gauge difference between those two.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Same is true with like a half step. Like if you're playing an E flat, 10.5s will feel fairly similar to 10s would, to the way the 10s would in E standard.
Okay, and one last question following up on this. maybe it's silly, but I just thought of it. Does the material construction, like let's say the alloy of the string, would that change the approach to the string gauge, or would that remain kind of the same, whether it's pure nickel or nickel bronze or whatever the alloy is? Is that going to have a shift in the string gauge?
Good question. It does have a shift in terms of the tension balance between things, but it's fairly mild because you still have the same standard core in there. So it's just like the percentage of the string by mass that is wrap wire versus core wire, which will have a slight change in terms of the tension. Overall, it's rare that we find that we would make a gauge substitution based on wrap material alone. Say, like, a 12 to 54 should really be a 12 to 52 in 80-20 bronze versus phosphor. We tend to keep those fairly consistent just because the impact is small, but there is an impact.
Okay.
But it can be a bit of a blunt hammer, moving up by a thousandth of an inch in terms of gauge is usually an overcompensation for something like that.
Okay.
Going from a 52 to a 53 would be overkill.
Okay.
But good question.
I try.
Yeah. In general, like the less dense the wrap wire, the less tension there will be. Higher density of that material will lead to more tension at the same gauge and construction style. Which 80-20 bronze and phosphor bronze, they're so similar. 80-20 bronze is 80% copper and 20% zinc. Phosphor bronze is 92% copper, 8% tin, and trace amounts of phosphorus. So you're still dealing with a fundamentally copper thing there with just a little bit of a change in other materials, which is why it's so close. But stainless steel and nickel, those are fairly different.
Okay.
While we're talking about tension, you also sell strings for baritone guitars. And just from looking at them, I suppose they're made for baritone guitars that are tuned the way, like the intervals are the same than on a regular guitar.
Yeah, exactly.
So whenever somebody comes in and says, I want strings for a baritone guitar, we're talking about the baritone guitars that are used for metal these days, for heavier sort of music. Are those just longer strings, or do you also use a different formula for the material? Because what I've come to find is I don't like baritone guitars for a very simple fact. Especially with heavier sounds, the mid-range sort of gets lost. Whenever I tried a baritone guitar and then I went back to my regular scale guitar with adapted strings so that I would have enough tension for the lower tuning, I was always happier, and the guitar was always set way better in the mix. When I was going back to the baritone guitar, I found out that it was more difficult to place myself in a band mix or even when recording the guitar, like placing the guitar well within the band context. And I was wondering if there's something you can do with the materials to balance for that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first part of your question, they're constructed very similarly. They're fairly identically to their same gauges that are made for non-baritone guitar. But the gauging itself is different for our baritone sets to try to accommodate some of what you're talking about. In fact, there could be a bunch of stuff at play there, so it's hard to know. Like baritone sets will typically feature a wound third instead of a plain third. That's going to have an effect on mid range. The scale length has its own sort of impact on the way a string resonates and what it sounds like. Generally, longer scale lengths sound a bit richer, but it can vary. And then, of course, pickups would and all that sort of other stuff that it is difficult to A/B. Because I was thinking through when you were saying that, I have a Supro baritone that's several guitars over. I don't think you can see it.
Right.
that I do experience a similar thing to what you're talking about, but at the same time, that has like a really unique, weird single coily pickup. So I just attributed it to that.
Yeah, that's something that always. That's why whenever you have a baritone, like heavier baritone guitar. I mean, there's so many companies that make them these days. You name them, ESP. It's a place company name here. So there are so many of them out there, and you can get them in all sorts of price ranges as well. Mm-hmm. But usually they also come with pickups that kind of promote that heavier sound, and that are like a little less heavy on the mids, and especially for that longer scale, it should be the opposite.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was just wondering if there's something you could do in terms of like material composition on the string.
Yeah. So we don't make this right now, but my gut on what would be like the easiest quick solution would be our orbiters, our coated electric strings on baritone would probably bring some more of that rich mid range to it, which would be really cool. We've wanted to expand the gauge range on those for a little while, and have had some hiccups on the material supply. We end up throwing away more coated nickel than we would like to get down to like the material that passes muster. So that's part of why we haven't expanded as much as we would like to, because timbre wise, a 7-string or an 8-string or a baritone with that material would sound really good.
Yeah,
it does. Okay. I've tried it. I just have to be able to make them for the mass market.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about going into like manufacturing strings for, even because you just mentioned like expanding mm-hmm. the business. We have a German manufacturer of strings over here. It's called Pyramid Strings. Yeah. And
they've been around a long time.
Yeah, for ages. Mm-hmm. And their primary business is actually to do strings for like orchestral instruments, mm-hmm. especially like contrabasses. And when I saw the pricing on a set of contrabass strings,
they're like $300-$400.
I mean, like the cheapest one was like $280, and I was like,
this is an interesting aside, if you don't mind my jumping in. So I have a few friends that are orchestral musicians that play in orchestras, and it's been interesting talking to them because they view strings very differently than guitar players do. If you are like an orchestral violin player, right. Your strings, for one, they're like $200. But you also, like, all those people that I've talked to, they care. They know exactly which string gauge is on their instrument, exactly which string brand, and could tell you the timbre difference between multiples of them. Whereas guitar players are like, I play this gauge. It's always worked for me. Never tried anything else. Not interested in it. This is what I got. It's very funny. But when you have a violin or a viola, you're not playing through pedals or an amp or anything else. It's the strings and the instrument and your bow and the rosin, and that's pretty much it. But they're way more expensive for sure. And a lot of the European companies specialize more in orchestral, whether it's Tomastic or Pyramid or some others as well.
So have you ever thought about expanding into that sort of territory, or is that a complete different ballgame?
Yes and yes. It'll be, I think, sort of like the last string thing that we do after we've kind of crossed through a lot of other, because it's involved and it's cool. I mean, you've got like situations with orchestral strings where they're using like spiral cores and very cool stuff. The thing is, what you want in a guitar string is different from what somebody that plays the viola wants in a viola string.
100%.
Like the biggest difference is that guitar players, you want to be able to pluck a note and hear it resonate out for as long as possible. Mm-hmm. For a violin or a viola, that's really bad. That's very difficult to control. They want a string that as soon as they're not bowing it, doesn't make any sound. Exactly. So that they can control it and not have all this resonance and all this happening when they're not meaning it to. So stuff that you could never do for a guitar string because it would sound dead. Is exactly what you can play with for orchestral. So it sounds really fun, but I'm not sure when we'll get there or not. It's its own market, and that market too. I mean, the companies that have been doing that for the most part have been doing it for a very long time. with the exception being D'Addario, who's only been at it for 40-ish years, which is, shorter than Tomastic or something like that.
Yeah.
And they've been able to break in, but they're huge.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But it seems like some of these companies, and since we're talking about expansion, some of these companies expand into ways that have nothing to do with their core business anymore. And sometimes I find it interesting. Sometimes I find it kind of unnecessary and a bit annoying, because you hear about that company coming out with a tuner, and you're like, okay, that's close to strings, tuning your guitar. That's fine. Although there have been companies around who specifically, worked on tuners because that's their core stuff. But then they come out with all sorts of merchandise, and then what's the next thing? Stuff that has to do with maintenance. Also fine. Total fine with me. I think where it stops is when the same company comes out with pedals. Then it's then to me okay, now you're getting kind of desperate.
I know what you mean. There's something that feels odd about that. And it's strange in strings. Virtually every company in the guitar space has at one point or another had the genius idea, we could make a fortune if we just get some of those repackaged strings and put our name on them.
Right.
But nobody buys them. It's a hard sell to get somebody to switch to a new brand of strings, especially when it's just thinking of a random example, the Rain Song acoustic brand of guitar strings. Yeah, exactly. No one really cares that much. But I know what you mean. There's when it comes to brands and what they can and can't do, there's these invisible lines where something feels okay and then something else doesn't feel okay.
Yeah.
And it's just totally on feel. Whereas it's if you're Fender, because you're the original, everything makes sense.
That's true.
There's nothing weird for Fender to do.
That's true. And then you have
except for an acoustic guitar.
Or a PA system,
and they do some of that. Yeah,
they did a PA system at some point, and I was like, why? It's just make your amps, make your guitars. I mean, even that's getting boring at sometimes. But
they also struggle with guitar pedals. They've been trying more than once to come out with guitar pedals, and despite being good, and they have engineers from other companies coming over helping them design the pedals. It seems like the market, and I'm kind of going off of something you just said, Scott, this concept that guitar players are not as malleable as you would think. Once they get set in their ways, it's really hard for them to digest and process something new coming from a company. Let's say I'm using X strings from this company. This other company comes out and they're saying, oh, we have this new alloy and we put our stuff in these cryogenic tanks and they're going to last for 50 years. And guys are like, I don't care. I've been using these and they work. And it's really hard to upsell something new. Do you find that this kind of having to race for diversity in products, innovation, is that something that affects the string industry and especially Stringjoy? Or can you guys kind of say, okay, we have this nice list of pedals, not pedals, but strings that we have right now. We don't need to innovate. We don't need to do that much research, because people, once they've dedicated to these strings, they're not looking for anything else. Is that the case with strings?
It's an interesting point. Yeah. So, I mean, we and everyone else, I think, are always, playing with ways that we can make strings better, make changes and all that. So there's definitely always an innovative drive on the string side itself. When it comes to bolting on kind of other products, for us, we do some picks. We have a couple of accessories here and there, and some things that we think will make some more sense that we're working on at the moment. Over history, it's a little interesting to me. Ernie Ball, early on, they dabbled with instruments. Before Music Man, they made the Earthwood acoustic bass. Then that was they revived that name later when they changed Slinky Acoustics to Earthwood Acoustics in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I don't know how that sold or anything, but it surprised me when I saw an ad for it. I'm like, Ernie Ball made an acoustic bass? Before they even had Music Man or anything. D'Addario, by contrast, they've really they have kind of this interesting ethos where almost everything they make is disposable. They make stuff that, whether it's a reed or a string or an orchestral string or picks, it's stuff that you have to buy again. Or even like the humidipack, like we have this humidifier, but you got to buy the refills and do this. It's not something you can just put water in.
Yeah.
So I suspect that there's something behind the scenes there that's been kind of a driving, or drumsticks, another good example, been a driving focus of what they will and won't make. They've shown some more discipline. Like, it surprised me there's not D'Addario pedals. They're massive. They have the scale to do it. But for one reason or another, they haven't. Yeah, I think it's fascinating.
I think it just comes from, looking at what the competition is doing and feeling like you might be losing out, or you might be like losing market share, or you might be like less in people's conversations. If you look at Dunlop, for example, Dunlop made picks, just picks and like some accessories around guitar playing, but it took them a while to say, oh, we're also making strings now. They're not making it for that long. So
Dunlop's
one
an interesting one. Because I think that they've done a good job over the years they've acquired stuff at smart times.
Yes.
They acquired Way Huge. They acquired Crybaby way back in the day. Dunlop started as a capo company. Yeah, MXR, of course. They made capos and then got into picks. And that's the hard thing, too, is it's like hard to... You could have said to them in the 70s, like, stay in your lane. You're a capo company. Don't make picks. So it can be hard. If it works, it seems like the most logical thing in the world. And when it doesn't, it's like, how did you ever think of doing that?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's the thing. But but Jonathan just came up with a very, very good point. So, somebody walks into a guitar store or a music store, and then they stand in front of the counter where like all these different strings are, and sometimes it's just a wall of overwhelming. It's like it's option paralysis essentially. Yeah. So what and we've already heard like you're active on social media. So what do you do on a daily basis, like marketing wise, to like break the ice with people? Because in comparison with me, you broke the ice with me when I tried your strings, but I'm working in this industry for over 25 years, and I know my strings, and I know when I have something or when I play something that is a good product. So, but not everybody has that experience, and not everybody is like has been around for that long time. So what do you guys do to break the ice in order for the guy who walks in to like remember, oh, there's Stringjoy as well, and pick out exactly your set and prefer it to the others?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, more stateside than in Europe presently, we do a lot of marketing. That's like a major function of ours, is to kind of spread that awareness and try to speak people's language online, rather than, I think a lot of companies just adapted the old magazine ads to the internet. Yeah. We try to be a little bit more native in platform and feel more like something you'd see when you were scrolling Instagram or watching YouTube or whatnot. So that's a big focus of us. Certainly, though, I think probably the biggest weapon we have in terms of growth and scale is all the people that play our stuff, that as you guys noted, that are excited about it and want to spread that word and share it to other people, which I think is super cool. For a lot of the string brands that have come and gone over the years, I don't know that they had that many people saying like, oh man, you've got to try these new Dunlop strings that I switched to. So that's been very cool and an exciting thing that we're able to kind of, grow.
That's nice. Yeah, it's usually somebody who gets endorsed by that company who says like, you have to try them out. It's not the guy who buys them. Why would he?
yeah. And that's its own interesting, bit to kind of go on with endorsed artists and stuff like that. That's a little tricky in our world. We have a lot of techs that we work with that use our strings exclusively, even when they're working for an artist that doesn't use our strings exclusively. And that'll come up a lot where we're like, oh, X player was using these on tour, and the tech's like, yeah, but you can't tell anybody. But that happens all the time because one tech I won't say the brand or the tech or the artist, I guess, so this will just be so as to not expose anybody.
But
he was working for, one of the great guitar gods, like one of the top 10, people. Okay. And this, said guitar god used one particular brand of strings and had always forever. And this tech was telling me, he was like, he used them, but he was like, every single show, I had to go through 5 or 6 different packs to find 6 good strings out of those packs of strings, because there'd always be, that A string's bad or whatever. And so he would kind of filter through them to find them, because this particular guitarist doesn't play with a backup guitar. They play with a very legendary Gibson SG. And there's no substitute for that. And so he was like, if he breaks a string, the show is stopped, and I am going to be in so much trouble. So he would cycle through all this, and I've heard this, an awful lot. From different techs and things like that. Because to those guys, they're like, it's my name's on the line here. I'll get canned. I'm not trusting that. So there's a lot of that where it's like, blankety blank only swears by X strings, but takes 6 packs every night to get one. Or even a lot of the big. Sorry, I should slow my roll. I get on a soapbox and then keep going. But I'll say this though, and to conclude it, even a lot of the big artists that use, X giant brand of strings, if you go to a show and they play a guitar and they play it for 2 songs, and then someone comes out and they grab the guitar from them, that guitar gets a new set of strings every 2 songs. And so do all their other guitars. So, a lot of strings can sound good for 2 songs. My favorite strings, if I wanted to change them every 2 songs, is whoever will give me the most strings. Ultimately. So I think it's a unique thing where I guess the point I'm making is that sort of junior pro all the way down to beginner guitarists actually in some ways need better strings than like the very top guys, because they don't have a man whose full-time job it is to change their strings after every 10 minutes of playtime and make sure it's all perfect. For the rest of us, we need something that's going to hold up day after day after day.
Do you feel that the competition on pricing with different brands is getting harsher these days?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I mean, for us, we've always been priced quite a bit higher than most of the bigger brands. It used to be more extreme when we started. We haven't changed the pricing on like our signatures since, I don't know, for 9 years or something. So they've kind of crept up while we've been able to kind of stay in a fairly similar territory, closing that gap a little bit. But it's tough. I mean, guitar strings, I have an old Gibson catalog from like the early 60s that lists all their guitars and then their strings as well.
Okay.
And back in the early 60s, guitar strings cost about $6. Same as they do now, right? But inflation adjusted, you're talking about $60. So to keep a product the same price over 60, 70 years, that ain't easy for a lot of these companies. And I often tell people, like, I don't think there's anything insidious, and I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly. But I think with any product, over that long of a time, if you can't raise the price, if you're just sort of paralyzed from being able to raise the price, you're going to have to find ways to make it, to still be able to make it for that price, even when that price is 1/10 what it was 60 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of like the hot dog at Costco.
Yeah.
It's always the same price. But now I know why it's that price. I had one and I burped it for like 6 hours straight. My wife was like, what the hell? I'm like, oh, that's what you get for $1.25.
Oh, that's terrible. Oh, shit. Are you in any way, because it's a current topic, are you in any way affected by the whole tariff thing that's currently going on? Are you buying stuff from abroad?
Good question. Yeah, so nothing that goes into our core products comes to us from an overseas supplier.
Oh, good for you. Good for you.
Yeah, so that part's nice. The thing, though, is that, some of these materials, like, there are not large nickel deposits in the United States.
No.
It's not where the asteroids with the nickel landed when they landed there millennia ago. Those are mostly in Canada, some areas of Russia, and a few other places. Same is broadly true of copper in a lot of cases. So, a number of steps up from us, there is, certainly an element of trade on like raw material long before it's, forged and drawn and all that. So to the degree to which that will affect us, I don't know. Not imminently and hopefully not, for a while, Yeah. We did see definitely like a number of price rises on raw materials in the course of COVID. So, we're used to that. I think as with anything, like all of our, the suppliers for our industry raised the price a bunch in COVID when prices spiked. And then when prices relaxed, they kept the prices exactly where they were.
Yeah.
Which is just kind of the way that stuff always seems to go, Anyway, that's a long answer to a short question.
No.
Thus far, we're doing all right. I'm not anticipating it being too bad for us.
Okay, that's good. I was just interested because it's affecting some people, especially
my friends
guys
in pedals and amps and guitars. That's no fun.
Yeah. Definitely not. We've already passed the hour. We always try to stay around the hour so the episodes don't get too long.
I'll take credit for that. I just, you get me started. I just keep talking.
Yeah. So I'm gonna hand this over to Jonathan and he's always preparing a funny game of rapid fire questions.
Yeah,
it's the same game or
I've altered it. Just because sometimes, depending on the guest, I like to get like specific questions. It's not going to be like the desert island thing, like what's your one pedal and amp kind of thing. But before
you can ask me that too if you want to. I do play guitar as well.
I will include it. But before I get to that, there's a question that's been bugging me the whole time, and I want to pick your brain about it real quick. Does the material, like the magnets in a pickup, are they going to influence the interaction with the type of strings you use? I've noticed from my experience, and this could be all in my head, I might be crazy, but I did record it and I do hear a difference. So when I use these guys, the Broadways, I like them with low wound single coil pickups like Strats and Tellys. But then when I go to humbuckers, I don't like them as much. So then I prefer the signatures. Is there some truth to this, or am I
totally?
Yeah. Okay.
Totally. Yeah. And it's not. You started with saying like the magnets, like that has an effect, but also like certainly something like a single coil versus a humbucker pickup. A lot of different stuff going on there, timbre wise. But yes, definitely. Like a lot of players will play different strings depending on the guitar or the pickup combination and what they're looking to do. If you've got one guitar that you want to brighten up. A thinner gauge of signatures would be great. If you want to darken it, like maybe 11s and a Broadways would be really, really great. So you're absolutely right. Every guitar has its own little flavor, and you can always use strings as an easy way to lean into that more or to balance it out a little bit, depending on what you're looking to do.
Okay, so wasn't all in my head. That's good. Good to
know.
No,
not in your head.
Okay, so I'm going to start with
unless this is all one simulation and we're all in your head, Jonathan. Which is always possible.
What? What? Don't do this. I didn't take my medication this morning. Come on.
Just remember if you took the red pill or the blue pill. That's
yes.
You gotta remember that.
And if you're colorblind, you're crap out of luck.
That's true.
So my first question for you, Scott, is if you could collaborate with another company. It doesn't have to be a string company. It could be any company that you admire, that you think there's a relation that you guys could team up and do something cool. Which company would that be, and what would potentially that collaboration look like?
Yeah. This will be, I want to go like way outside the box, but the one that does call to me is fairly in the box. Our neighbors up the way, Gibson, they're on the same street as us, just a couple miles down.
Wow. Okay.
I have wanted for a long time, and I suspect one day we'll get the chance to do this, to work with them to actually recreate the old Gibson strings that used to exist. Gibson made their own strings until the late 2000s, before they shuttered that. They weren't always the best strings, but back in like the 50s and 60s, they had these strings called Mona steel that were made from Monel wire, but made a kind of specific way. I've taken these apart. I have like recipes listed for them. I've made some of them for myself so that I could see like what strings would have come on a 59 Les Paul. That would be one. I would love to be able to kind of remake those authentic old Gibson strings. Because when you'll see on the current packaging, it'll be like the vintage style, but it's not. It's like a pure nickel. It's not the style that was actually used back in that era. I think it'd be really fun to make those.
We have to send this to Gibson. Just send that clip, send it over to
them. we have some friends over there because we're so close and stuff. So we've floated it here and there. I'm not sure when it'll be a priority or not, but that would be really cool.
We have to make that happen.
Yes.
So my next question for you. So let's say I'm a high gain guitar player and I play like fuzz and all sorts of like really distorted tones. What would be your personal recommendation in terms of Stringjoy strings? What should I be looking at? Should I be looking at the orbiters, the signatures, the Broadways? What would be your pick?
Yeah, it all depends, like if you're doing sort of like stoner rock where you want like more bottom end and more sort of like doom out of that, you want to lean into that like bottom end of the fuzz, I would go heavier gauge and into something like our signatures or our Broadways. If you wanted more of like a searing kind of cut through sound on the fuzz, then I would go a little bit lighter gauge and then go signatures or orbiters even. To add to that kind of sparkliness on the top. So it all totally depends on what people are looking to do. There's no right gauge for any particular like instrument or genre. It all just depends on the like in metal. Tony Iommi played eights for a long time, and then other people play 13s.
Yeah, exactly.
and both can be very metal in different ways.
Now here's a controversial question for you. Why no flat wound strings at Stringjoy?
So I won't like move my camera, but everything that you see, my entire coffee table here in my office is filled up of these strings that have a little tag noting exactly what recipe went into them for making flats. This lovely jazz box has flats on it as well, and then I have a P bass over the way that has some flats on it as well. Ooh. So we are and have been for a long time working on it. Current plan is to launch flat wound guitar really soon, and then follow up with flat wound bass maybe 5-6 months after that. We were always planning on the inverse, but we want to do a little bit more beta testing with some actual like live people on the bass side of things. To make a flat wound bass 130. Like a 5-string bass. Ooh. Here's the process. So you ball end the wire, right? And then you wind the first turn of wrap wire, let's say clockwise, up to about 37 inches. Then you take a different wire in a different direction. You go counterclockwise this time, and you start it manually a little bit before that wire and go just a little bit past it. Then you do that one more time with another wire again. You switch direction, and then you go over it. Then typically you're going to have to grind that final round wire on top. So you grind that one down and smooth it out. Then you put it on the flat wire ribbon machine. You wind it with this stainless steel ribbon wire, which is really sharp. It's kind of painful. So you wind that all the way through to the end, then do a spread wind at the end so that it doesn't break on the tuning peg. Then you polish that first manually on a machine with a couple different passes of a grit, and then typically we like to follow up with 2 to 3 different grits of paper manually by hand to get it to a nice sheen. Then you have to silk the ball end, which is hard because you only have this much room. So you apply silk with glue, and then you spin it manually while you silk it, and then you have to apply more glue and usually use a lighter to kind of flame off the back so that it doesn't fray. Then you have to do that again on the tail end side, and you do that the whole way. Then you cut off the bit, and then you have to go through the normal packaging process. So it's a bunch. It's a bunch of stuff.
That makes me wonder. Like I lived in Europe for 4 years, so I was in Belgium, and I used to buy from Thomann, and they have flat wound strings for like 10 euros. They're dirt cheap.
Yeah, the human made Thomann strings.
Yeah, and because they're so cheap, that's what I have on my P bass, because that's all I play on the P bass, right? Mm-hmm. They are garbage. They are garbage.
I assume they're Chinese strings. I've never played those Thomann strings, but I've always been curious.
But even for like the E string, it curls up and it coils and it does all these weird things.
Yep.
So that's why I was like, I hope you guys make flat wounds so I can put it on my P bass and finally get some good strings, because they are expensive.
Yeah.
Like flat wound strings for bass are super expensive.
And ours won't be cheap either, but they won't be as expensive as like the Tomasic, certainly.
But everything you just said,
involved.
I think would be like your sales pitch. It's
Yeah.
like, why are our strings so expensive? Just go back to that podcast. Have a listen.
Well, and for us, I mean, that's the reason it's taken so long. As I've mentioned, we've tried out so many combinations and of everything with strings. With flat wound bass strings in particular, there are so many permutations. I can change each of those things I mentioned. I can do with 3 different, diameters of wire or more. And then, on flat wounds, just the slightest bit of gap between each flat wound wrap can turn a flat wound string into sounding like a stainless steel round wound string. So there's so many permutations that you can play with. So it's been hard to reach you ever have that song or that album you've been recording and you're like, it's really good. I'm excited for you to try to listen to it, but it's not ready yet, and it won't be for a long time because I'm not done tweaking it.
So 3 more questions for you. What, in your opinion, are the most underrated Stringjoy strings? They could be for acoustic, for electric guitar, or bass.
Ooh. So my favorite, this is close to this. My favorite, like, sort of off-label use or like secret menu thing is our 12 to 52 Broadways, an electric guitar string with a wound third, are really cool on acoustic. It's a pure nickel round core string. Yeah, because it still has, it's a 12, 16, 24, 32, 42, 52. So very similar gauging to an acoustic string. And they're cool. They've got like less mid-range content. They're warm, but they have a nice like bright top end and low bass. I think those are super cool.
And
you just gave me an idea for a video.
And
okay, we would be happy to help with that.
If my math is correct, the tension should be way more fun to play around with bendings and stuff.
Yeah. It's just like similar gauge. It'll fit in your nut really well. It shouldn't require a different setup, but they're much more flexible and easier to kind of play with. So I think those are super fun.
Good
cool.
One.
So 2 more questions. You alluded to it earlier, but do you have anything that you can tell us for any future releases in Stringjoy strings? Do you have anything cool in the works that you can kind of drop hints so that we can speculate?
Yeah. Well, the imminence of the flat wounds is itself somewhat of a leak. Just for you guys here.
Okay.
Though, we've been talking about it for a while, but we're planning on flat wound electric guitar, hopefully happening, by late spring or early summer.
Okay.
So that's what we're kind of full bore ahead on right now. Flat wound bass, hopefully after that. In terms of things after that, we'd be pushing in the next year. Those will probably be our 2 big things this year. And I'm not sure, looking at a few different things. All around there. I still have 1 or 2 the hard thing is there's some things I want to do on like electric guitar, but there's also like I want to get into ukulele and eventually classical guitar and some other instruments and stuff like that too.
Cool. Perfect. And here's my last question. And because you said you were interested, that's why I kept it. So here's the popular, you're on a desert island, you have 1 amp, 1 guitar, and a handful of pedals. What would that look like?
Ooh, how many's a handful? I thought it was just going to be 1.
It can be up to 5 maximum.
Okay. Oh,
Let's keep
wow.
it super simple.
Okay. So my favorite kind of tone that I like is like a kind of lo-fi thing. So if I had to pick 1 guitar, it would be I have a rosewood telly that was like one of the made in Japan ones in the 80s, like the George Harrison style Telecaster.
Oh yeah.
I would hang on to that. Amp wise, I'd probably go with like a Vox AC, AC15 or AC30. The only mistake here being there's not going to be a Vox repair tech on that desert island, which means I'll have just a few months of good playing before inevitably. And in terms of pedals, my favorite overdrive has always been my Small Sound Big Sound Mini, just for having the bias control where I can make it sound really ratty and fuzzy or really hi-fi and open. In terms of things above that, gosh, the handful I wasn't prepared for, but that's exciting. I'm going to go with a Strymon Deco for that same kind of sound.
Good one.
And then I need some sort of cool modulation because I can get echo off the Deco. I'm going to go with, what's it called? Shoot. The Mr. Black Twin Lasers, which is a digital phaser. The reason I like it, the mix goes way down. With analog phasing, and there's like you can't really have a mix control. It doesn't work. Yeah. But since this is digital, there's a mix, so I can get really subtle phasing that you kind of barely hear. That just adds some movement here and there, which I really like. And it's got a preset switch, so I can go from that to intense wobbly phasing.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
I'll go with those three. That'd be fun.
Nice.
Oh, can I have a DL4?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
I would like, since it's just going to be me on an island, I would like something I can loop with.
Yeah.
Ideally.
Now, in terms of strings, I assume it's going to be D'Addario, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On a desert island, I better go with the elixirs.
Oh, heavy coated
I would bring our Stringjoy orbiters with me.
orbiters.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good choice.
It'll last forever.
Good choice.
Where did this concept of the desert island come from for people? Why is it such a universal thing that we all have?
I think it just has to do with the fact that it's sort of a personal question because you kind of lay out some of the things that you cherish the most.
Yeah.
And obviously, depending on what kind of topic we're talking about, this could be a podcast for beauty products, and then I would ask, what are your top 3 beauty products you take on a blah blah blah. And
it seems like an abundance mindset. Like you have to have more stuff than you need for like us all to feel like, what would you actually keep if you had to?
Exactly.
Yeah, and my take on it, like when I started these questions, was to find out what the person's really about. So if I tell you, like, what are you bringing to this desert island? I've had answers like HX Stomp and my guitar. That's it. So there's some people that are very like practical and pragmatic, and you have other people who are going to be like, oh shit, I didn't expect this question. And now they have to get to the fundamentals of who they are as a player. So then you're going to get to find out what guitar they're going for, the amp they're going for, and the tone. So you go, this person's into stoner, this person is into like clean tones, and they just want to use pedals as like some like these different colors. So that's what I like about it, because you always get to find out what kind of player you're dealing with by eliminating option paralysis. And then you go, okay, this guy's a metalhead, this one's into country or whatever. So that's why I use these questions. I mean, they're silly, they're fun, but at the same time, you get to see like the person saying, I can't live without my tube screamer.
I love it. Yeah. I was almost tempted to say one of the Ampeg like 8x10 SVT cabinets, because I'm relatively sure you could build a boat out of it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And then get off the island and get back to having 300 pedals.
You're gonna have to get the speakers out of there, but sure.
Yep. You can that and a screwdriver.
What's your bass? Nice.
Scott, this was really nice. I've learned a lot. And there were a couple of things that obviously, there are a few things that I had insights to, but getting to pick your brain was really nice. Thank you for taking the time. And for everybody who's interested in checking out Stringjoy, it's as easy as just go to stringjoy.com. That's your guys' website, where you can also purchase the strings directly if you wish to. And if you live outside the US, I think, I mean, I ordered from you guys, but there are people out there who don't like to deal with, customs and paying customs fees.
We've gotten a bit better about that. Like, and we're always working to improve it. Right now, you can order from outside the US and we'll handle all the customs fees and all that sort of stuff now. And we're working on even cheaper shipping for international. But we do have a lot of great retailers internationally that might just be easier for folks too, which is A-okay with us.
And that was the other thing that I was going to mention. So if you are on Stringjoy's website, there's also a section where it says dealers, and you'll find a dealer close to your region. You're working with hundreds of dealers all across the globe. So it shouldn't be too difficult to find your strings at one of those stores.
That's our hope. More and more all the time. But guys, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to say what a pleasure it was talking to you both. And, I feel like we just talked about me, which feels a little bit bad, but it's been good for me. So thank you for having me.
All right. And well, to everybody tuning in and listening to this, we hope you have a great day. And until the next episode, see ya.
Cheers.